The sky over the small-town grocery burned with a bruised copper dusk, the kind that pressed people into hurried silence, when a little girl suddenly broke from the sidewalk crowd and ran straight across the parking lot, sneakers slapping wet asphalt, tears spilling freely as she threw herself toward the police dog sitting calmly beside his handler. The crowd froze in a half-circle as if trained. Carts stalled, conversations dying mid-breath, because something about the child's panic felt dangerous to witness. She didn't cry out for help. She clutched the dog's collar with desperate certainty, as though she already knew he was her only chance. The canine's body stiffened instantly, ears snapping forward with surgical focus, not reacting to her fear, but to what rode behind it. And the veteran handler felt the shift before he fully saw it. He didn't rush, didn't shout, just lowered his center of gravity and placed himself between the girl and the rest of the world. Eyes, quietly, scanning while his hand rested firm on the leash. The air carried fryer grease, damp cardboard, and beneath it, something sharper, wrong, chemical, and the dog's nostrils flared as his gaze locked across the lot on a dark sedan, idling too far from the entrance to be innocent. The car's headlights were off, engine murmuring low, exhaust curling like it had been waiting, and for a heartbeat, a phone screen glowed inside before vanishing. The girl's sobs hitched as she whispered that single warning, barely audible, yet heavy enough to tilt the moment. They're here. Not someone. Not an accident. Them. The handler noticed how her eyes never left the sedan, how her hands trembled only when its brake lights flickered faintly, how fear had sharpened her instincts instead of scattering them. Around them, bystanders practiced survival, staring at shoes, receipts, anything but the truth unfolding yards away, because power in this town had taught them that looking came with consequences. The dog gave a low, professional growl, restrained but unmistakable, and the handler felt the familiar calm settle in, the one that arrived when danger clarified purpose. He crouched slightly, voice even, grounding, asking her name, asking what she saw, while every muscle in his body oriented toward that car. She swallowed hard and admitted she wasn't supposed to tell anyone, that she'd been warned, that men had been watching her house, and tonight felt different. The handler didn't react outwardly, but inside a line was crossed, because children don't invent fear that specific. The sedan shifted, tires crunching softly, and in that suspended second the handler tightened the leash, knowing whatever waited inside had just been seen. Earlier that morning, before fear learned her name, the town had woken under pale sunlight and clean air, and the veteran handler moved through it with the unhurried rhythm of someone who knew every crack in the sidewalk and every face behind the windows. He walked his K9 partner along Main Street as shop owners lifted metal grates and nodded greetings that carried years of quiet trust, the dog pacing perfectly at his side, alert but relaxed, tail low, eyes cataloging without suspicion. This was the version of the town people liked to believe in. Kids biking too fast down side streets, a bakery door chiming open with the smell of bread, a hardware store radio murmuring local news. The handler stopped to help an elderly man load bags into his truck, exchanged a few dry jokes, and moved on, his presence less about authority than reassurance. The dog accepted a gentle pat from a cashier who knew better than to distract him for long, then refocused instantly, a living balance of warmth and discipline. A few blocks away, the family moved through their own ordinary morning, unaware of how fragile that word really was. The mother packed lunches at a scarred kitchen table, humming off-key while the father checked his phone for work messages that never quite came on time. Their kids argued softly over cereal, the little girl tugging at her brother's sleeve, asking if she could walk home from school later, wanting to feel grown. They lived in a modest house with peeling paint and a yard that never quite looked finished, but it was clean, lived in, safe in the way routines can feel safe when you trust them. The handler passed their street during patrol, nodding to the father as he loaded tools into the trunk. The dog briefly glancing toward the house before looking away. No alarm, no sign. Just another home among many. What none of them noticed was the sedan parked half a block down, engine off, windows dark, a shape that blended too well into the scenery of small-town normalcy. It had been there long enough to feel permanent, long enough that neighbors stopped registering it, long enough to be ignored by people trained to mind their own business. Inside, a man watched the family through a narrow gap in the glass, checked a list on his phone, and sent a single message that read only, "Confirmed." Back on Main Street, the handler and his K9 continued their rounds, stopping by the school to say hello to teachers, exchanging easy smiles that masked the weight of responsibility he carried without complaint. The dog paused once, ears twitching as if catching something distant, then relaxed again, dismissed by a world that still felt orderly. The mother waved as the kids left for school, the little girl glancing back with a strange flutter in her chest she couldn't explain, while the father kissed her cheek and promised dinner would be early. It was a day like any other, wrapped in harmless details and familiar paths. And that was the most dangerous thing about it. Because somewhere between the bakery and the hardware store, between a wave and a promise, someone had already decided their lives were inconvenient. Her words came out in broken pieces, stitched together by breathless sobs. But every fragment landed with the weight of something rehearsed in fear rather than imagination, as she clutched the handler's sleeve and tried to be brave enough to finish what she'd started. She said the men had been there for days, maybe longer, always at different times, always pretending not to look. And her voice cracked when she admitted she'd tried to tell her parents, but stopped because the men had smiled at her once. The kind of smile that felt like a warning. Tonight was different, she insisted, shaking her head hard as if to force him to believe her. Because the air around their house smelled wrong, sharp and sweet at the same time, like cleaning fluid mixed with hot plastic. And there was a low humming sound she could feel in her chest even when she covered her ears. She said a van had parked across the street just before dinner, white but not clean, with a company logo taped over in uneven strips, the edges fluttering when the engine vibrated, and that was when her stomach dropped. Because grown-ups didn't cover logos unless they didn't want to be seen. As she spoke, the K9's transformation was immediate and absolute. His body locking into stillness so complete it looked carved from stone, tail frozen, ears rigid, eyes no longer tracking movement, but pinpointing threat. The unmistakable posture of a working dog who had identified a problem before anyone else had the words for it. The handler felt the change ripple through the leash, felt the dog's breathing slow and deepen, a controlled readiness that set his own nerves into sharp alignment. And he crouched lower so his voice stayed level, asking gentle, precise questions while his peripheral vision cataloged exits, reflections, shadows. She told him the humming stopped whenever someone opened a door, then started again once the house went quiet, and that when she leaned close to the window, she saw a tiny blinking light in the bushes near their fence. Red, then dark, then red again, like something watching them breathe. Around them, the parking lot seemed to pull back, sounds muffled, the world narrowing to the triangle between a child who had trusted her instincts, a dog who had confirmed them, and a handler who now understood the shape of the danger. The K9 let out a barely audible huff. Not a growl, but a signal, and angled his head toward the street leading to the girl's neighborhood, nose lifting as if tasting the air for confirmation. The handler followed the line of that focus and felt his jaw tighten, because the chemical tang she described lingered faintly even here, carried by the evening breeze, subtle enough to be ignored by anyone not trained to notice it. He asked her one last question, whether the men had ever come inside. And when she whispered, "No, not yet," he felt both relief and urgency collide, because whatever this was had been waiting, studying, preparing. He stood then, smoothly, placing himself fully between her and the lot, one hand firm on the leash, the other already moving toward his radio, while the dog remained perfectly still, a silent warning made of muscle and intent, telling anyone who knew how to read him that a line had been crossed and whatever came next would not be ordinary. The shift in the handler was subtle enough that most people missed it. But anyone who had ever relied on him in a bad moment would have recognized it instantly. The way his shoulders settled and his breathing slowed as he slid fully into mission mode, calm voice steady as bedrock while his mind accelerated. He guided the girl gently but firmly behind his leg, positioning her where his body and the dog formed a shield. Then lifted his free hand in a simple, authoritative gesture that sent nearby bystanders stepping back without argument, space opening as instinctively as water around a stone. He didn't raise his voice, didn't announce danger, because panic was a contagion he refused to release into the air. Instead, he asked quick, precise questions in a tone that felt safe, confirming addresses, names, timing, all while his thumb brushed his body camera to life, the faint click masked by the ambient noise of the lot. The canine moved without command, drifting half a step forward and angling his body, nose dipping toward the pavement before snapping up again, eyes fixing briefly on a man leaning too casually against a newspaper box near the entrance. The handler followed that line of sight and noticed the man's hand buried deep in his jacket pocket, knuckles pale, posture stiff in a way that had nothing to do with waiting for a ride. The dog's tail gave a single, slow sway. Not friendly, not aggressive. A professional flag that said, this person mattered. The handler adjusted his stance, placing the leash under controlled tension, and spoke again. This time into his radio, in a low murmur that sounded routine to anyone listening, but carried coded urgency to those trained to hear it. The dog's nose dropped back to the ground, tracing a faint arc that led away from the sedan and toward the side street, following a fresh scent trail laid minutes ago, not hours, sharp enough to cut through oil and asphalt. The handler let the dog guide him a step, then another, careful not to telegraph the movement, his eyes scanning reflections in car windows, catching the flicker of a phone screen disappearing behind tinted glass. He noted the way conversations nearby resumed too loudly, how laughter rang false, how people suddenly found reasons to linger while pretending not to watch. And he cataloged faces with the cold efficiency of experience. The girl clutched the back of his jacket, trembling but silent now, and he murmured reassurance without turning, promising she was doing exactly right, promising he wouldn't let her go. The canine paused near a trash can, nostrils flaring, then snapped his head toward the grocery's automatic doors, locking eyes with the man by the newspaper box, who shifted his weight and glanced away a fraction too late. The handler captured it all, the fixation, the timing, the micro-movements that told a story clearer than words and quietly repositioned so the store's cameras framed the scene as well. Somewhere close, a device hummed faintly, barely audible, and the dog's ears twitched in response, confirming what the handler already feared. Someone nearby was listening, watching, adjusting. He tightened his grip on the leash, made a second radio call requesting a specific unit without explanation, and kept his voice level as he asked the girl one more thing: whether anyone had told her not to talk to police. Because the way danger organized itself around them now felt practiced, coordinated, and very, very close. The radio crackled back with the familiar voice of the local supervisor, smooth and almost bored, and the handler felt a cold weight settle in his chest as the response came far too quickly. Dismissive before the facts had even finished landing. "Probably a domestic misunderstanding," the supervisor said, tone folksy, reassuring in a way that felt rehearsed, advising him to calm the situation, gather names, and clear the area so traffic could move. The handler kept his reply professional, laying out the sensory cues, the vehicle, the potential surveillance device. But each point seemed to slide off the other end unheard, replaced with gentle deflection and procedural delay. Around them, the air shifted, the easy hum of a public place curdling into something tense and watchful. And the K9 sensed it too, body tightening again as if responding not to a single threat, but to the realization that help was not coming the way it should. The handler glanced at the girl, at the way her small hands twisted together as she listened, and something hardened behind his eyes. Because children don't fabricate details like taped-over logos and chemical smells, and systems that ignore that precision are making a choice. He acknowledged the supervisor with a clipped copy, then muted the radio without asking permission, the decision clean and immediate, like closing a door against a rising storm. Protect first, ask permission later. The old rule surfaced unbidden, and he moved on it with the confidence of long experience, repositioning so the girl was fully blocked from view and motioning for her to stay close to the dog, whose presence steadied her more than words ever could. He scanned the lot again and noticed subtle changes he hadn't wanted to confirm. The sedan's engine revving slightly. The man by the newspaper box shifting to put distance between himself and the handler. The hum growing louder for a split second before fading, like someone adjusting a dial. The handler's jaw tightened as he realized the system's slowness wasn't incompetence but design. A way to let problems resolve themselves quietly without paperwork or outside eyes. He made a second call on a different channel, one that didn't belong to the local chain of command, requesting a welfare escort under the pretense of a routine check. Careful with his language, but unyielding in intent. When the supervisor cut back in, irritation edging his voice, the handler responded with calm finality, stating he was securing a minor witness and potential evidence and would file his report after the fact. There was a pause on the line, long enough to speak volumes, then a warning about procedure that went nowhere, because the handler had already stepped past it. He knelt briefly to the girl's level, telling her she'd done the right thing, that she was safe right now, and felt the dog lean subtly into his leg, a silent vote of confidence. As he stood, he caught a glimpse of someone across the lot watching him with open displeasure, phone raised but not recording. And he understood then that whatever was circling this family had roots that reached into places that were supposed to protect them. The sound decision settled like steel in his spine as he guided the girl towards safety. Because ignoring fear this specific was not a mistake he was willing to live with, no matter who told him to stand down. The moment that cracked the town's practiced blindness came quietly, almost anticlimactically. When the handler followed the K9's nose to the family's parked car and noticed a detail that didn't belong. A tiny black puck tucked high beneath the rear seat frame where a child's booster had been latched earlier that day. He didn't announce it, didn't dramatize, just slowed his movements to a deliberate crawl, signaling with 2 fingers for space as the dog sat perfectly still, eyes never leaving the vehicle. The handler crouched, angling his body so the girl couldn't see, and confirmed what his instincts already knew. A miniature camera microphone unit, magnetized, wired for remote power, its indicator light disabled but not erased. A predator's eye hidden where only someone looking closely or trained to would ever find it. He slipped on gloves with practiced ease, narrated the discovery in a calm, neutral voice for his body cam and carefully bagged the device, sealing it with the kind of precision that said this wasn't his first time holding something dangerous masquerading as ordinary. The K9 exhaled once, a soft release, then shifted his focus outward again, scanning for reaction. And that's when the handler noticed the ripple moving through the crowd, the way people leaned despite themselves. Phones rising not to record him, but to make sense of what they were seeing. A bystander, a young woman who'd been pretending to scroll, caught the exact moment the device was lifted into view, the handler's gloved fingers pinching it against the fading light. The dog sitting rigid and watchful beside him like a sentry. The clip was short, shaky, and devastating. And within minutes, it leapt from phone to phone, a visual anchor too concrete to dismiss, proof that fear had fingerprints. The handler felt his radio buzz again, sharper now, questions replacing dismissal. But he didn't answer immediately, because the town had already begun to answer for itself. Murmurs turned into outright questions, names whispered, eyes tracking the sedan as it slowly rolled forward, then stopped, unsure whether leaving would draw more attention than staying. The handler stood, evidence secured, and addressed the crowd without accusation, simply stating that a child had been monitored without consent, that the device would be processed, that anyone with additional footage should preserve it. And in that moment, something shifted. A collective intake of breath as people realized they were part of this, whether they wanted to be or not. The K9 moved to the girl's side and sat, pressing his shoulder lightly against her leg, grounding her as she stared at the bagged device with a dawning understanding that she hadn't imagined anything. Notifications chimed across the lot like distant bells, and the handler caught fragments as he passed. Is that real? That's her car? Why would anyone? And knew the open loop had been set. The town could no longer pretend this was a private matter, a misunderstanding to be smoothed over, because now it was on screens, on timelines, in living rooms, and whatever had been hiding in plain sight had just been dragged into the light, blinking, exposed, and very much afraid of what came next. In a private office above a downtown storefront, where the curtains were always drawn just enough to suggest taste, not secrecy, the men who ran the town's true machinery sat around a polished table that reflected their smiles back at them like a second set of masks. The room smelled of expensive coffee and old paper, the kind of place where deals were made with handshakes and consequences were outsourced. And on the wall hung framed photos of ribbon cuttings, charity checks, and civic awards that turned reputations into armor. One man leaned back in his chair as if he owned the air, fingertips steepled. His voice warm with practiced patience as he spoke about the family, the way a contractor might speak about a rotting beam. They're decent people, he said, almost kindly, which is exactly why they think they're safe. Another man, heavier, with a tie loosened like he'd been working hard, scrolled through security footage on a tablet. Grainy frames of a late-night scene at the edge of town where trucks had pulled up behind a fenced property and unloaded barrels into a shallow pit. He paused on a moment where headlights had caught a figure standing too close. A silhouette with a phone raised. The kind of accidental witness who didn't understand what they'd captured. They saw the drop, he muttered, tapping the screen. Not all of it, but enough. The first man's smile thinned. The third, quieter, wearing an expensive watch that never showed stress, slid a folder across the table with the calm of someone who had done worse in better lighting. Inside were printouts, license plate numbers, a mortgage statement, a school schedule, a child's photo clipped from a social feed, every ordinary detail repurposed into leverage. It's not just dumping, the watchman said, voice low, precise. It's the facility. He didn't say the word rehab with air quotes. But the contempt was there all the same, because the rehab facility outside town was a front. A clean sign over a dirty operation, a place where money moved through fake invoices, where people disappeared from paperwork, where grants and contracts were siphoned until the town's official records looked like success. The heavier man rubbed his forehead, annoyed more than worried. "We've kept this contained for years," he said. "Local officials know which side their budgets come from." The first man finally let the warmth drop from his tone, eyes turning hard as glass. "And now there's a K-9 officer bagging a mic in a parking lot," he said, and the words landed like a slap. The watchman tapped the folder again. "They're already nervous. They've been nervous since the night they saw the trucks. They haven't gone to the papers. They haven't gone to state. But panic makes people unpredictable." Silence settled, thick and heavy, the kind that wasn't uncertainty, but calculation. The first man glanced at the tablet again, then at the family photo, and said the line that made the room's temperature change. "If they talk, we lose everything." No one argued. No one asked if. The heavier man exhaled through his nose and leaned forward. "So we scare them," he said. "We remind them where they live." The watchman shook his head once, minimal. "Scared people record," he replied. "Scared people run to the wrong person." The first man's gaze drifted to the window, the thin slice of town visible between curtains, lights blinking on as evening approached, and his voice lowered into something final. "Handle it tonight," he said, as if ordering dinner. The watchman stood without haste, collecting the folder, already mentally assigning roles. And as he left the room, his phone buzzed with the same clip circulating through the town. Gloved fingers holding a hidden device. Proof that time was shrinking, that their old methods were suddenly visible, and that tonight would not be as quiet as they wanted. Night fell fast, the way it does in small towns where the horizon is low and the streetlights feel like thin promises. And by the time the handler's cruiser rolled quietly onto the family's block, the air had cooled into a damp, metallic chill that carried every sound too far. He'd insisted on escorting them home. For a statement, the official wording a shield for what was really happening, and the father had tried to protest. Embarrassed, confused, still clinging to the idea that trouble could be reasoned with. But the mother's eyes had flicked to her daughter's trembling hands, and she'd nodded, because something in her recognized danger before it arrived. The K-9 moved first, stepping out into the dark with controlled confidence. Nose lifting, ears twitching toward the quiet spaces between houses, and the handler read his posture like a language he'd spent years learning. Alert, not panicked, focused, not reactive, as if the night itself had fingerprints. Inside the modest home, the handler's calm competence filled the rooms like a second layer of walls as he checked locks with quick, practiced motions. Tested the back door, noted the flimsy latch on a kitchen window, counted exits, and placed the family where sightlines favored safety. Kids near an interior hallway, mother within reach, father close enough to help but far enough not to blunder into danger. He kept his voice low and steady, asking the father for keys, asking about neighbors, asking whether anyone had spare access codes, all while the dog paced a slow circuit, pausing at the front window to stare into the dark. "We're going to leave," the handler said softly. "Not if, but when. But we're going to do it smart." He positioned a chair under the front doorknob, not because it would stop someone determined, but because it would buy seconds, and seconds were everything. He killed unnecessary lights and left a single lamp glowing in the living room to suggest normalcy, then moved through the house again, angling blinds so anyone outside would have to get close to see in. The mother watched him with a tight grip on her son's shoulder, trying to keep her breathing quiet, while the little girl stood near the dog, fingers buried in the fur at his neck like she'd plugged herself into courage. The first warning arrived as a flicker. Living room light dimming, brightening, dimming again. As if the power line outside had been tapped or tested, and the handler's eyes narrowed. His hand drifting toward the radio he still didn't fully trust. Then came the vehicle. A low engine note easing down the street and pausing directly in front of the house. Not parking, not passing, just idling as if waiting for permission. The dog's head snapped up, body rigid, and he let out one controlled growl. One. Quiet but sharp enough to cut through the home's held breath like a warning shot. The handler didn't rush to the window. He didn't give the watchers the satisfaction of seeing him flinch. He guided the family away from the front of the house, spoke in a whisper that carried authority without fear, and began the quiet plan he'd already built in his head. Out the back, across the yard, into the cruiser, and gone before anyone could force a confrontation. Outside, the engine lowered, then rose slightly, and a second set of footsteps crunched on gravel near the side gate. Too many for one person, spaced like a team, while somewhere down the street another car door shut softly, the sound almost polite. The handler felt the town's ugly machinery turning closer, heard it in the timing, in the coordination. And as the dog's ears angled toward the backyard with that same stone-still focus, the handler understood with a sick clarity that this wasn't a lone bully making a threat. This was a practiced move, supported, funded, confident. They were already closing in, and they hadn't come alone. A sharp, hurried knock came from the back door. 3 taps, a pause, then 2 more, so deliberate it felt like a code, and the handler's hand went up instantly, freezing the family in place as the K9 pivoted toward the sound with silent precision, shoulders squared, nostrils flaring, evaluating the scent before teeth ever entered the equation. Another knock followed, softer now, and a voice slipped through the wood, shaky and urgent. "Please, listen. I don't have time." The handler didn't open it. He didn't even move closer until the dog's posture shifted from threat to wary recognition, nose twitching as if the person outside carried fear more than aggression. He eased the blinds a fraction, just enough to see a man standing in the narrow spill of porch light, hands lifted, empty, his jacket unzipped as if to prove he wasn't hiding a weapon. The man's face looked familiar in the way bureaucrats do, forgettable by design. But the handler placed him. A clerk from the municipal office, the kind who stamped permits and shuffled files and smiled too quickly when questions got too sharp. The man's eyes were wide, wet, and he kept glancing over his shoulder toward the street like he expected the darkness to reach out and grab him. "I saw the video," he whispered through the crack, when the handler finally unlatched the door just enough to speak, chain still on, his body blocking the opening. "I saw what you found. They're going to do something tonight. They already sent people." His words tangled over each other, breath fogging in the cold, and his hands shook as he fumbled inside his jacket, not fast, not sneaky, but frantic, until he produced a small plastic bag and held it up like an offering. A flash drive sat inside, along with a folded stack of printed pages, edges bent as if he'd crammed them into a pocket and run. "That's access logs," he said. "Keycard records, gate times, camera pings. The facility, the trucks, the nights they said it was maintenance. It's all in there." The handler's face stayed composed, but something in his eyes tightened, because men like this didn't show up at houses in the dark unless the dam had already cracked. "Why bring it to me?" the handler asked, voice steady, and the man swallowed hard. "Because everyone else is owned," he said, the words bitter as pennies on his tongue. "Because I tried to tell my supervisor last year and He laughed like I told a joke. Because when I asked why the invoices didn't match the grant reports, I got a warning in my mailbox with my kid's school picture clipped to it. His breath hitched, and he glanced toward the family inside, seeing the little girl's silhouette in the hallway, seeing the dog like a sentry beside her, and shame flashed across his features. They've been pressuring this town for years, he admitted. Permits get approved that shouldn't. Complaints disappear. Calls get rerouted. And anyone who pushes back, they ruin them. Or worse. The handler felt the pieces align with a cold click. The supervisor's instant dismissal. The practiced paralysis of bystanders. The sense of invisible hands steering the response. This wasn't a single threat aimed at one family. It was a system that had learned to protect itself. A network woven through offices and uniforms and polite civic smiles. The K9 leaned forward, sniffed the man through the narrow opening, then sat, tense but not hostile, like a verdict. The handler reached out with gloved fingers, took the bag and papers without breaking eye contact, and in that second, the man exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for years. "They're outside," the man whispered again, voice cracking. "They brought someone from out of town, not local. The kind who doesn't care who gets hurt." The handler's jaw flexed once. Controlled fury kept behind professionalism, and he nodded as if receiving a routine handoff, even as the stakes climbed another rung. "You just did the right thing," he told the man, calm enough to lend courage. "But you're in danger now, too." Then he shut the door quietly, chain sliding into place, turned to the mother and father with the flash drive in his hand like a key to a locked room, and understood with brutal clarity that what hunted this family wasn't improvising. It was coordinating, covering, and counting on everyone staying small, and he had no intention of letting that happen. By the time the first pale strip of dawn slid over the rooftops, the handler had already turned the night's fear into a clean evidence chain, and that decision, protect first, document everything, push past the compromised bottleneck, became the spark that lit the entire network on fire. He'd kept the family tucked in the safest interior space of the house while he worked in controlled silence, logging the hidden device from the car, sealing the flash drive and access logs from the shaking clerk, and narrating every transfer and timestamp into his body camera with the steady cadence of a man building a case that couldn't be lost by anyone local. He used a channel that didn't route through town leadership, then a second, then a third, until he reached the kind of office that asked sharp questions and didn't accept folksy excuses. And when he finally spoke, he didn't plead. He presented a minor witness, attempted intimidation, a recovered surveillance device, digital records tied to a facility with suspicious late-night access, and corroborating details that matched public video already spreading through the community. The response was immediate in the way true authority can be when it isn't bought. Instructions to secure the family, hold the evidence, keep comms tight, and prepare for an arrival that would not be announced to the usual gatekeepers. An hour later, while the town still pretended it was waking up to another quiet day, unmarked vehicles rolled in like silent thunder, tires whispering over damp roads, professionals moving with purpose, faces neutral, eyes trained to see the seams in a story. They didn't knock on the supervisor's door first. They didn't ask for permission from the men with framed awards. They came straight to the handler, verified the chain, duplicated the data, and then the operation unfolded with the clean inevitability of a trap closing. The rehab facility outside town was hit at first light, warrants, badges, evidence techs, while another team locked down the municipal office systems, pulling server images and retrieving deleted call logs before anyone could reach for a shredder or an accidental power outage. At the same time, Traffic stops appeared on the edge of town like checkpoints in a storm, intercepting the vehicles that had hovered near the family's home the night before. One driver tried to smile his way out, another tried to run, but neither outran radios that worked and hands that didn't shake. The first arrest happened quietly, then the second, then the third, and once the first domino fell, the rest had no choice but to follow. Because networks depend on silence, and dawn is loud. By mid-morning, the respectable faces were no longer untouchable. They were being escorted from offices and back rooms into open air, their practiced smiles replaced by tight jaws and darting eyes as cameras captured what the town had been too afraid to name. Files were boxed, hard drives bagged, doors sealed with tape that meant consequences. And the supervisor who had dismissed the handler's call stood pale and furious as someone from outside read him his rights like a procedural fact. In the middle of it all, the family was moved with care, not spectacle, relocated to a safe place with clean blankets and quiet walls, while the mother and father finally let their shoulders drop for the first time in days, pulling their children close like they were rebuilding something that had almost been stolen. The little girl, exhausted but steady, reached for the canine's muzzle with trembling fingers. And the dog, all disciplined power and loyal restraint, softened just enough to press his nose into her palm, warm breath fogging against her skin like a promise kept. The handler watched that small moment, tender, ordinary, earned, and felt the tension in the town loosen in real time, neighbors stepping outside, whispers turning into statements, fear turning into outrage, and then into action, because now they had proof and a path forward. And as the sun climbed higher, painting everything in unforgiving daylight, the handler understood the ending wasn't just arrests and headlines. It was the sound of a community exhaling after years of holding its breath. Because one child had run to the right dog, one veteran had refused to look away. And the truth, once set in motion, could not be shoved back into the dark.